Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 47, What does the inside of the proton look like? On this podcast, we several times talked about the fact that protons and neutrons are not elementary particles. Elementary particles in the sense that they are point-like particles, that they have nothing which they consist of, but are elementary in the sense of being really the elemental parts of matter, which is assumed for electrons and other particles, but for protons and neutrons, we do not believe that it is the case. Actually, we know that this is not the case because we know that they consist of different particles, which we call quarks. And usually one says that particles like protons and neutrons consist of 3 quarks, but actually those are only the valence quarks. And in this episode, we want to talk a little about that, a little bit about how much more complex the proton actually is, but also much more beautiful, I think. So when we found out, or when in particle physics it was found out that protons and neutrons are not the elementary particles, but that they consist of, or that they have a substructure of particles inside of them, these so-called quarks. Of course, this had to be confirmed doing measurements, and the measurements that are still used to show this are particle accelerators, where particles are accelerated to huge speeds close to the speed of light, and then they are collided with each other. And in these collisions, a lot of things are happening. New particles are created. These particles interact with each other. And with this, we can really find out about how these particles do interact with each other. But we can also find out the structure of the particles that we collided. So, I mean, of course, there are also electron-electron colliders, there we will not find out a lot new about the structure of the electrons themselves because they are point-like particles, so there is no substructure or nothing beyond them to find it. But at the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, for example, they are colliding protons, so we can learn a lot about this substructure by these scattering experiments, and this is also what was done there. And we also need to keep in mind that the higher the energy is, so in particle physics, higher energies always mean closer distances. So the higher the energy is that I use, the closer I can look to the particle. This is basically the rule there. And so the higher the energy, the more we are able to resolve the substructure of protons, neutrons, and other particles. And what was shown there is that the distribution of these particles is not flat, but for point-like particles that would have been to be expected. So we even saw there, okay, it cannot really be that these protons consist of only these 3 valence quarks, because then we would have had this kind of flat distribution, which we did not have. So we knew there had to be something more going on. And there it was introduced a scale, which is called X. And this scale basically tells us how much of the momentum of the proton is in the specific valence quark. So how much of it, which percentage, so to speak, is in this, of the momentum of the proton is in this valence quark. And you might expect, you might say, okay, we have a proton, we have 3 valence quarks, so I would assume that about a third of the momentum of the proton is in each of these valence quarks. Maybe one has a little less than a third, but then the other therefore has a little more than a third, and altogether it yields the complete momentum of the proton. That would be the idea, right? However, this is not what we see. So especially to higher energies, we see that the valence quarks have much less than a third of the momentum of the proton, and this is all of them. So you might even think, okay, is momentum not conserved anymore because they don't add up to the whole proton momentum, or what is happening here? So what is this scale violation. How also the scale x, which basically shows the amount of momentum in these of the proton in these particles. How is this way so violated? How can this be? What is the reason for this? And the reason for that is that a proton does not consist only of these point-like valence quark, but that there is a sea of particles that through splittings and mergings of gluons is created. So we have learned that gluons are basically the same thing like light is it's the same thing for the strong interaction, like light is for the electromagnetic interaction, or photons for the electromagnetic interaction. And this is basically what the gluons are for the strong interaction. And they can be radiated from the quarks, and then they can themselves decay into quarks or radiate other quarks, do all kinds of stuff, more even so than the photons, because the gluons themselves carry a charge, which the photons do not. So there's a lot of things going on there where the valence quarks can radiate gluons. These gluons can create other quarks, which are then called the C quarks, because actually in this proton there are not only these valence quarks, but there are a bunch of other quarks which are called the C quarks that are just created in these kind of fluctuations and so on. And therefore, the proton is basically not just some three-particle structure, but it is really a structure of a lot of particles that are flowing around there. And depending on how much momentum it has, this even increases. So for high momentum, high energies, it is the case that basically the valence quarks only make up a small amount of the momentum of the proton. Okay, time for a short break. This time I will not read an excerpt from my science fiction novel Alien Thoughts, because there are great news. For if you are an English listener or only English speaking listener, then this might not be that big of a news for you, but I wrote a new book. It's a crime novel. It's also about topics like software development, open source, and so on. However, it's right now only in German, and it's also part of some competition where I could hand it into some publisher in Germany, and if it gets really well, then I might be able to receive an award or something like that if I'm really lucky. But still, it's currently published only there, and therefore also the rights are of course only there. So until then, I cannot publish it otherwise, also not in English, I think at least. But just to keep you informed about what's going on, and this is the book is called The Odysseus List. Also, this is a pun in some sense, so I'm not sure when I translate it how I will resolve that. But if you are a German speaker, or if you can understand the German language, then I really encourage you to get it. It's in Thalia. You can get it there. You can order it as a print book. There's no ebook yet. So if you are fluent in German, then I encourage you to read it and to order it, and to also write a review, because this is always helpful to me, and of course also for the competition itself. So if you are interested in this, then check it out. It's called Die Odysseus Liste. And as soon as there is a development in getting this book out in English, you on this podcast will be the first to get to know about this. For high energies, the most amount of the energy is in the C quarks and the gluons. So I think at high energies, it's mostly you can basically assume that the proton basically only consists of gluons anymore, because there is so much momentum in there. And also in the C quarks, for example, there I think at some certain energies, it's just like more than 50% of the momentum of the proton is in the C quarks and so on. So it's not just these 3 valence quarks that are flying around there. There's a lot more going on. And this is also described by so-called Proton distribution functions. They basically describe all these things, how much momentum is in the gluons, how much momentum of the proton is in the C quarks, how much momentum of the proton is in these valence quarks. And you can see this in these distributions, especially at lower energies. You can see the peaks at the up and down quarks for the proton and the neutron. You can see the peaks there, but if the energy increases, there's more and more a general peak at the C quarks and gluons, because they begin to dominate the proton's momentum. So these Proton distribution functions, by the way, they are not calculated. They are measured at the LHC, and the LHC uses then to know at which energies how huge the part of the momentum is that goes into the valence quarks and that goes into the C quarks, because as we have seen, the problem that the LHC has to deal with is that they do not only know the momentum of the protons that they are colliding, but they don't know so much about the momentum of the actual particles that are interacting, the quarks and so on. They don't know their initial momentum, which makes it much harder to really make these computations, to analyze the results, and therefore they need these Proton distribution functions and these scale X to really know what particles are present the most, where the momentum of these particles is. And this scale variable X is oftentimes also called the Bjorken X. And this is named after theoretical particle physicist J.D. Bjorken, who recently died. So this August, he died at the age of 90. And he was really really great theoretical physicist. He was behind these Bjorken X variables, so he introduced this, and also he came up with together with Clashow, he came up with the idea of the charm quark, because I'm not sure if I have mentioned it on the English podcast, but it is the case that as we have seen, protons and neutrons consist of quarks, and they consist of up and down quarks. And so this, for a long time, or for some time, this was the only quarks that we know. So we thought, okay, there are up quarks, there are down quarks, and basically protons and neutrons and all the other hadrons consist of them. But then we found hadrons that are not seem to have different quarks in them. And the one quark that was first found was the so-called strange quark, because it was named this way because it seemed strange that there is a particle that is a quark that is neither an up quark nor a down quark. So this seemed really strange until they had the idea, okay, maybe these quarks come in families, kind of like the leptons come in families of electrons, muons, taus, and maybe the same is the case for the quarks, and they come in families. And so they postulated a charm quark, which would, in a charming way, close this gap, or close the thing that they had there, the issue that they had there. And this was what Bjorken and Clashow postulated or introduced also, and this particle was then indeed found. So I think Bjorken was someone who was, I think he was also sometimes recommended for the Nobel Prize, but he never won it. And he was still a brilliant physicist, and I had also the pleasure of being in a talk of him once. So he was once at our University of Heidelberg. He was giving a talk, and this was several years ago. I mean, he was already past 80 then, and he was basically in his retirement, and basically was talking to some degree. In some part of his talk was about what he all experienced, which physicists he met, Pauli, Feynman, and so on, and how his life as a physicist was like and so on. And also he talked a little bit about things he's interested now that he's retired, because usually he was as a physicist, you only do stuff that is in your field, as you are pretty specialized in your field, and oftentimes you are the only expert in this field, but you are not observing other topics oftentimes. And once you get in retirement, many use this to also look into the different topics that they might be interested in. And he was talking a little bit about that he is looking into general relativity and stuff like that. And what was also interesting then is that the question came about what he thinks of string theory. And he mentioned then that he thinks this theory is a pretty powerful tool chain, the tools that it gave to mathematics and so on. But he was also critical of it being considered a theory like the Standard Model or similar theories, because of the lack of proof, the lack of confirmations or verifications, as we have stated in our episodes to string theory and so on. And he even brought this comparison where he said in the US it was basically forbidden to teach creation science or creation in science, because it was said that the creation theory or theories of creation don't hold up to scientific standards, and therefore it would not be right to teach them in science classes. And this was the argument brought forth then. And Bjorken compared this to string theory, where he said that this also does not hold up to these standards of verification and so on. And therefore, he emphasized that he thinks it's a powerful tool in some sense, but he does not believe it to be a theory comparable to other more successful theories. And the interesting part is, as I knew from the professors that I knew, there were many professors in this talk who were working on string theory and who were pretty passionate about string theory, and to look in their faces was kind of amusing at that time. But I think he was not impolite, he was not dissing them or something. He was saying in a polite way how he thought of it, and I think it's an opinion that is pretty common among scientists who are critical of string theory, and therefore this was nothing that they did not hold a grudge against him. They understood where he stood and what he was saying, but still they of course weren't amused about it. But I think this was pretty interesting. It showed also the differences that are there in science among scientists. But it was a pretty interesting talk, and he was to me he seemed like a really nice guy. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.